Welcome to the Building Evidence for a State System of Support, Massachusetts Strategy for Improving Low-Performing Schools webinar. This webinar is a culminating event for our Massachusetts School Turnaround Partnership through the REL Northeast Islands. And today you're going to hear an overview of the state system of support, as well as an overview of the findings in two of the research studies the partnership conducted. Additionally, we'll talk about the implications for these studies and how they will impact the state system of support moving forward, and give folks time for Q&A, questions and answers. Finally, at the end, we will wrap up and give you some time to complete our evaluation form. So today's presenters include myself. I am the MAST Partnership Lead and Researcher for the REL Northeast Islands. It also includes Erica Champagne. She's going to present the overview of the Massachusetts Low Performing School Monitoring Process and talk about implications of the research. Ms. Champagne is the Director of the Office of Effective Practices and Turnaround at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And in this role, she directs the state's efforts to evaluate and share best practices in school turnaround. The other presenter today is Jingtong Pan, who is a researcher on the REL Northeast Islands. He led the study that focuses on the rubric that Massachusetts uses for monitoring the lowest performing schools, called the Turnaround Practices and Indicators Continuum. Dr. Pan's research focuses on employing advanced quantitative methodologies and statistics to investigate the extent to which contexts come together to support positive child development among demographically diverse populations. So first, before we get started, who we are. The REL Northeast Islands is one of 10 regional education laboratories. It's funded by the Institute of Education Research at the U.S. Department of Education. And the REL Northeast Islands serves Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And what we do, basically in partnership with key educational stakeholders, the REL NE supports them through research studies, sharing evidence-based practices and findings, and supporting the use of evidence, as well as providing direct support to stakeholders in the use of data and research to inform decisions. The Massachusetts School Turnaround Partnership had a particular goal, basically trying to support the state policymakers in using and applying research and consider adjustments and refinement to strategies to support low-performing schools based on studies conducted and findings, and then to identify and develop strategies for low-performing schools and districts to use extant data to improve decision-making. The objectives for today's session are to learn about the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education strategy to monitor and incentivize continuous improvement in the state's lowest performing schools and their districts. Additionally, participants will be able to access the state system of support's monitoring tools, and finally, understand the relationship between school-wide student outcomes and ratings on the monitoring tools based on findings from the REL Northeast Islands MAST partnership studies. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Erica Champagne to talk about the overview of Massachusetts systems for monitoring and supporting low-performing schools. Erica?
Thank you, Susan. Good afternoon. Erica Champagne, Director of the Office of Effective Practices as part of our statewide system of support in Massachusetts. And I'm happy to be able to have the opportunity to share with you as a preface to the research you're going to hear about, an overview of our work to support school turnaround at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Massachusetts. Since 2010, we've been implementing both state and federal school turnaround policy through our statewide system of support. In 2014, after being a few years into this work, supporting schools and districts in the amazing work of turning around schools that need extra support, we have conducted research in 2014 saying we need to know what practices are in place in schools that are engaged in successful turnaround efforts. And that research led us to focus our state assistance model on 4 areas. We refer to them as the turnaround practices. And so as you can see here, the 4 turnaround practices are these large categories of strategies that successful schools in Massachusetts were implementing, schools that were successful in seeing rapid improvement for students. And they are leadership, shared responsibility, professional collaboration, strong intentional practices for improving instruction, systems of supports for all students, and a strong school climate and culture. And these practices are very well aligned to some of the most recent research that's been coming out about school improvement efforts since that time. And so with this focus, in 2014, it allowed us to align our statewide system of support to the 4 turnaround practices in an effort to help schools focus on evidence of what is working, at least here in Massachusetts. We aligned our state planning requirements, our school improvement grant, and other state and federal grants focused on school turnaround. We aligned our school site visit process to these 4 turnaround practices, and most importantly, our direct assistance strategies. We also continued over the last several years to mine our site visit data for evidence of best practices. And we've developed additional tools and resources for schools and districts so that they can see and hear what other similarly situated schools in their state were doing well in their improvement journeys. And then as part of this cycle, this continuous improvement process, we, in 2016, commissioned a large-scale evaluation project with a research partner at EIR to see if when school improvement grantee schools using large-scale federal funds focused on evidence-based strategies aligned to these 4 turnaround practices, did they see improved outcomes for students? And what we found was that quite in contrast to some national studies that have come out on the impact of the federal SIG program, we found in Massachusetts that we had statistically significant improvement in student outcomes in schools receiving federal SIG funding through our Massachusetts model aligned to these 4 turnaround practices and getting DESE support. Those schools, when compared to similar schools that did not receive that funding and those supports, were seeing statistically significant improvements in student outcomes, and even those increases were equivalent to 1 additional year of schooling in both ELA and math. And then also in 2016, we asked our research partners to go beyond just a statistical fits analysis on the impact of our turnaround program and the SIG program specifically by asking them to analyze our school site visit data, referred to in Massachusetts as the monitoring site visit process, or MSV process. Our MSVs gather qualitative and quantitative data on a continuum of implementation on 28 indicators aligned to these 4 turnaround practices I've been talking about. This analysis showed us which indicators were most impactful in turning around schools in our state. And so they're highlighted here. I know it's hard to see, but hopefully you can access the slides later or go look at our research reports at your own leisure. But one really important finding that you can see that resonates here is that in the school culture and climate turnaround practice area, all 5 indicators there were critical to improvement efforts by our schools that were successful in improving outcomes for students. And so I'm going to take just a minute to spend a little bit more time talking about our MSV process, since it's such a key data set and the analysis that's going to be described in more depth by my co-presenters. So as I stated, MSVs collect evidence of implementation of systems and structures that support a rubric aligned to the 4 turnaround practices. Evidence is collected through instructional observations using the class tool by Teachstone, a staff survey, interviews and focus groups of staff, students, and administrators, and an extant data review. AIR, our vendor that conducts the MSV process in our schools, uses both qualitative and quantitative analyses to measure and a prescribed process for integrating data sources to develop ratings on each indicator. The final reports for the schools are first and foremost intended to provide formative information to schools and districts on their implementation of the turnaround practices. It also allows for cross-school comparisons at the district and school level and allows both the department and schools and districts to make comparisons of school progress over time, which you'll hear more about soon. These reports are used, again, most importantly at the school and district level to formatively inform their continuous improvement, but also are used by our direct assistance providers at the department in targeting supports to districts and schools that they work with. And so in addition to this impact study and implementation study, these studies have been incredibly valuable in shaping our assistance efforts at the department over the last several years. We also asked our research partners to produce resources and reports that are in a format that is more desirable than maybe statistical analyses for our districts and schools. And so we have had several reports and resources developed over the last several years, and you can see a few of these are just previewed here, and we have much more on our state website under the statewide system of support. And now I will turn it over to Susan and Jingtang to discuss some of our most recent research.
Thanks, Erica. So the first study we're going to talk about here is the relationship between the instructional observation scores and school-wide student outcomes in Massachusetts, specifically in the low-performing schools. As Erica mentioned, for monitoring of the lowest performing schools, Massachusetts relies on the CLASS tool, which was created by Teachstone, and this selection was really made because it has evidence that consistently high scores on the classroom domains are significantly associated with improvement in student outcomes. And this is based on prior studies. However, what's a bit different about the way the Massachusetts State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education uses this information is that it's really a sampling of a set of classrooms within an individual low-performing school, only collected once per year, and it's information that are provided in terms of averages and observations about variation in scores by classroom. The theory of this is that, it does have an evidence base, but the question was still outstanding as to whether the improvements in instructional observation ratings were actually associated with improved outcomes when you looked school-wide. But really what Massachusetts was concerned about was trying to make sure that low-performing schools were really consistently supporting students in the classroom with high-quality instruction and trying to understand how that instructional core is impacting student outcomes. So I should note that as a state education agency, Massachusetts is really trying to strike a balance between its capacity to collect information and provide feedback to these schools. And thus, so an annual kind of data collection and sampling, this seems like an appropriate method that was not so burdensome on the low-performing schools, but provided some important routine data to the schools. And it is not seen as something that should replace instructional observations at the school and district level, but rather something that provides a feedback loop and a kind of dipstick type of check on what's going on in the school. So for those of you who are not familiar with CLASS, it primarily focuses on the interaction between students and teachers and the quality of those interactions in the classroom. And it focuses on three domains. Under each of these domains, as you can see listed here, are several dimensions. And in addition, CLASS takes into account developmental levels. So they provide certifications. Observers are certified and then have to recertified on an annual basis at each developmental level. And in this case, it would be early elementary, and secondary levels. And each observer needs to be certified in the appropriate level to be able to observe a classroom at that level. So for the purposes of this study, we focused on elementary and secondary grade spans. And the elementary grade spans are grades 4 and 5, and the secondary grade spans are grades 6 and 12. So the three domains that we focused on here are emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support, as you can see. The way instructional observations are scored are on a scale between 1 and 7. 1 to 2.9 is considered, 9.9 is considered a low range, and a mid-range is 3 to 5.99, and then a 6 or 7 score is considered high range. And the high range is considered effective interactions that are observed consistently and frequently and sustained and are of high quality. The samples of this study are the Massachusetts designated low-performing schools, as designated by the State Accountability System. And the observations that we examined were gathered during the 2016-17 school year as well as the 2017 and 18 school year. The study really looks at ratings and student outcomes at the elementary and secondary levels. And the sample includes a total of 100 elementary and secondary grade spans composed of 88 low-performing schools. So this means that some schools, 12 in total in this case, served students in elementary and secondary grade spans. So for example, a K-8 school would be examined from the elementary as well as the secondary levels. What do the demographics look like in these low-performing schools? When we looked at them, compared to the state average, it suggests that the sample of low-performing schools tends to serve more Black students, Hispanic students, and then the state average, and fewer white students than the state average. And the low-performing schools in the sample serve more economically disadvantaged students and more English learners when compared to the state average. In terms of academic performance, not entirely surprising. In these schools, ELA and math scores were below the state average, and since that's one of the key indicators for how these schools get identified, it was not that much of a surprise. And scores in math at the secondary level, you'll note, were particularly low. And again, academic growth on average was below the state median, although ELA at the secondary level had more variation, with some of the low-performing schools performing above the state median growth. In terms of class domain scores, so remember this is a range from 1 to 7, and you can see the low, mid, and high range indicated in this graphic. In the sample of low-performing schools, they scored highest in the area of classroom organization and lowest in the area of instructional support. And this is aligned with national averages reported by Teachstone and other studies on class. However, classroom organization did seem to be slightly higher than what we've observed in other studies, and it's something that's worth investigating further. You know, some of the literature in this space suggests that there's often when a school is identified as low performing, things like expectations for the classroom and plans for the day are often listed on board, so that may be one of the reasons for that in this particular sample. And although the average domain score for the sample of low-performing schools really provides a general indication of the level of instruction within the sample, the variation within the sample can show whether schools are similar or different in quality of instruction, which could have implications for how a school approaches support or differentiating support for the low-performing schools. For the classroom organization domain, most of the average scores for elementary and secondary low-performing schools were in the mid to high range of quality. And in the emotional support and instructional support domains, most of the schools were in the mid-range. So the distribution of scores ranged from 1 to 7 for both domains. A higher concentration of low-performing schools scored in the low to mid-range in the instructional support domain. You know, that flatness of that domain suggests there's a lot more variation in there. Again, variation within the schools means that there's within the schools, it's really looking at how much of a difference between classrooms There may be classrooms that are scoring very high on all the domains and then some that are very low. So really kind of looking at that. And the variation within schools, you can see here, was highest in the emotional support and instructional support domains. So after conducting our correlational analyses, we found that classroom organization ratings had a statistically significant and positive relationship with student achievement. And in this case, we define student achievement as the percentage of students who are meeting or exceeding expectations on the state assessment, and that's at the school-wide level. So in other words, 1 point of increase in the classroom organization rating was associated with more than a 5-point increase in student achievement. So more than 5% of more students were performing, had met or exceeded expectations. We did not find a significant relationship between ELA or math achievement in any of the other domains. However, when we looked at school-wide student academic growth, a higher rating in each of the domains was in each of the instructional observation domains was positively related to an increase in academic growth in English language arts as well as in math. So in English language arts, the increase in academic growth ranged from 3.3 based on 1 point increase on the emotional support domain rating and a 4.2 increase in academic growth related to the classroom organization domain. Similarly, a 2.7 increase in school-wide academic growth based on a 1 point increase in instructional support. Similarly, in math, a 1 point increase on the instructional observation rating was related to a 3.6 point increase in academic growth for within emotional support, and then in classroom organization, it led to as high as a 7.6 point increase in academic growth, school-wide academic growth. And so this actually provides just a summary of these findings with the asterisks indicating those relationships that are significant and positive. The limitations of the sample, there are certainly a few. The first is that the sample was limited. It's limited to low-performing schools only. We don't have these data for other schools that have not been designated as low-performing based on the state accountability system. And there was definitely purposive classroom sampling in terms of oversampling in English language arts, math, and science, because those are the content areas in which their state assessment data. However, there were always other classes included in these, so it really did try to look at overall instruction. In terms of another limitation, the outcome of academic achievement, the outcomes of academic achievement and growth were the only school-wide student outcomes that we looked at. As you'll see, we kind of learned from this and realized things like chronic absenteeism and other factors may be student outcomes of interest, and Jingtong will dig into that a bit when he talks about our examination of the rubric. And then the definition of school-wide academic achievement may limit our understanding of the relationship within the instructional domain scores. And really the reason for the choice of the percentages of students who are meeting or exceeding expectations on the state assessment had more to do with the shifting of the state assessment over the time period we were examining this information. There are likely other ways that it would be a bit more sensitive and kind of see more nuance in shifting those school-wide academic achievement, but for the purposes of the study, that was one of the limitations we had to face. So again, I want to remind folks, if you have questions, please place them into the chat. We will be responding to questions and answers at the conclusion of the reporting of the study 2 findings and some implications from Erica. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jingtong.
Thank you, Susan. And hi, everyone. Welcome. And it is my pleasure to present the research findings for the second study looking at the relationship between state annual school monitoring indicators and the outcomes in Massachusetts low-performing schools. This is sort of like a recap of what Erica mentioned earlier, using the school monitoring indicator as the predictor or the indicator of school performance. So a quick summary of the rubric. So this is the Massachusetts Turnaround Practice Indicator Continuum as the rubric, and it is used to both monitoring school progress and also provide feedback to schools and districts. And it involves a iterative evolving process that it has been revised to better reflect specific issues related to elementary and secondary education. The rubric was developed based on research conducted in Massachusetts low-performing schools, and also based on other research. But it has not been there has not been an evidence showing the relationship between school monitoring rubric and school outcome. And the rubric is publicly available for transparency purpose, and also for supporting other state agency to better support their school performance. So a quick overview of the sample. So in terms of the sample, we are collecting data. We have collected data from 91 schools who had at least one turnaround practice indicators rating across a 2014-15 school year to 18-19 school year. And some schools had more than one turnaround practice visit. So in together, there are 229 monitoring visits from 2014-19 through 18-19. And about 2/3 of the schools have had more than one visit. And in terms of the outcome, we used annual school level outcome data, including school level mean student growth percentile in English, language arts, and mathematics, as well as chronic absenteeism rates. And you'll be probably interested in what mean student growth percentile is. It is described in the Department of Education, Secondary Education website in Massachusetts. And it is a average growth score that each student received, which is relevant to a similar level of prior achievement, and it describes how a student's performing, progressing as an extent to which it's better or worse than similar students in the same year. So here it's a very quick overview of the indicator continuum. There are four-point rating system: limited evidence, developing, providing, and sustaining evidence. And in terms of the rubric, there are 4 domains, as Erica mentioned it, 4 practice area or domains, I call it. And in each practice area, there are 5 to 8 indicators, and in each indicator, there are 4 evidence level, which is showed in here, and they are they're based on a slightly different rubric, but very relevant to the content of the indicator. So this is just a very brief example of what the indicator and the rubric look like. Here comes the findings. So remember we talked about the studies primarily looking at the relationship between indicator, rubric, and the school performance outcome. So half of the turnaround indicators had a statistically significant relationship with school-wide student outcomes in the preferable direction, and the effect size is 0.25 or greater, and no indicator had a statistically significant relationship with worse outcomes. A quick overview of the indicators presented in here. I removed the indicators that do not have a a statistically significant and practically meaningful relationship with the outcome. So here we have two turnaround indicators in turnaround practice. The first turnaround practice area, leadership, shared responsibility, and professional collaboration, and 5 turnaround indicator in the second area, which is only related to English language arts or mathematics, but not related to chronic absenteeism, and 4 indicators in the third practice area and 2 indicators. And you may also want to interested to combine this finding with what Erica presented from the interview with stakeholders and see how they are similar or different. And let's take a deep dive at each practice area or turnaround indicator domain. Here, the first practice domain, we have 2 indicators with a statistically significant and strong relationship with chronic absenteeism, and this is going the preferable direction. Although you can see there's a negative correlation, it means higher level of the rubric rating is associated with lower chronic absenteeism rate. And you may wonder, how do we calculate the effect sizes? And because we don't have a comparison group. So it is just a proxy. It's kind of reported to quantify the magnitude of the relationship between an indicator rating and the outcome as a proportion of the standard deviation. So it's basically it's the estimate coefficient beta divided by the standard deviation, so to like better quantify what it actually means to the outcome. The second practice area, most of the indicators are related with either English language arts or mathematics, and 4 indicators are strongly related with English language arts and mathematics student growth percentile. The third area, there are also 4 indicators that are strongly related with English or mathematics. My apology, not mathematics, but one related with chronic absenteeism. Although there are many indicators statistically significantly related with math, but the effect size is smaller than 0.25, which we used as a cutoff for strong relationship or practically meaningful relationship. And the last practice area, there are only 2 indicators that are strongly related with English language arts, mathematics, or chronic absenteeism. In terms of limitations, of course, there are many limitations here. First of all is the limited sample. Because the turnaround practice and indicator ratings are limited to schools identified as low-performing school, the sample, it's sort of limited in size, and the results may not be generalizable to higher performing schools or to other similar schools, not designated as a low performing in the state. And moreover, this study is based on a correlational nature, so it does not demonstrate any causal relationships, and we didn't apply any experimental condition to the sample. So the finding definitely does not demonstrate any causal relationship. And some indicators may not predict school outcomes in the short term, like what we did here. We basically correlate indicator ratings with school outcomes cross-sectionally. So it's a concurrent relationship, that's what I call it. So some indicators may not predict school outcome in the short term, but may predict them in the long term. So, but the small sample size of the sample of low-performing schools with data across multiple years limited the ability to expand the study scope to looking at the relationship over a long term. So only short-term outcomes were estimated. Finally, the study team also noticed some inconsistency. If you look at the report, we conducted a sensitivity analysis to look at all indicators within the practice area, to using all indicators from the same practice area to predict the outcome, and we reported some inconsistent findings. For instance, 3 turnaround indicators were associated with chronic absenteeism rates in an undesired direction. I'm not going to go dive deep into the undesired correlation here, but if you're interested, feel free to look at the report. There will be more discussion there. And here I'm going to turn to Erica to discuss the implications. Okay?
Yes, great. Thank you so much. So this, as you've just heard about these 2 studies, these are just 2 examples of the ways in which Massachusetts sort of leverages our support system and data collection on schools to be able to learn about school turnaround efforts in our state. We're currently in the early stages of updating our site visit process and updating, in fact, our entire statewide system of support, trying to really focus on culturally responsive practices and racial equity at the classroom, school, and district levels. We really know now more than ever that it's imperative that we really shift our focus as a state agency to having the most impact in addressing racial inequities in our schools and districts. And so we really want our assistance model to drive that support. And so stay tuned for all of that work coming in the next year or 2. But one of the key drivers for that revisioning of our model and our monitoring process will be done with a strong commitment to continue to gather data that can be used to measure impact and disseminate best practice. We had a question in the chat that was great that I think really is one that I can address here, talking about implications. It was, what advice would we give to other states embarking on a similar journey of trying to collect data to be able to drive your assistance efforts? And I think often times in conversations with other state leaders, monitoring at the state level is often done sort of at a program level, and not always done in a way that can be, that collects data consistently across schools, so that you can actually compare across schools, across districts, and really, as you can see, what we oftentimes are able to do is to actually, run statistical analyses and look for relevant patterns and trends across our schools and across our state. And so that's an incredibly important component of our process, that we want to make sure that we're collecting that data that can be compared across our state. So that's a good piece of advice. And I think the second piece is that when you are intentionally building a system to serve your state's monitoring function, to do that in a way that gives you data that you can mine for patterns, trends, and evidence of best practice, it actually saves us money in the evaluation space, because we have this data set already for one purpose that we can use for research and evaluation. I think I'm handing it over to Susan so she can facilitate the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Erica. And I just really want to encourage folks who are on the webinar to please put any questions that you have in the chat. We're compiling them, and we'll have plenty of time to respond to any questions you have. I am going to kick it off with one question that was actually in the chat. It was about hearing more about how LEAs or districts and teachers reacted to the process itself. And with the caveat, there seems to be a lot of state oversight for the improvement process based on the observation data. And this person is from Maine. Many of the LEAs in Maine feel strongly about local control. So it seems like some communities would struggle with this much oversight. I'm wondering, Erica, if you might want to respond a little bit to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Massachusetts is also a local control state, so we empathize with that particular situation. But I could just give a quick overview. Happy to talk about this in more depth offline for sure if you want to reach out to me. But I think at first our process of our site visits was really conducted in purposely for schools that were under our state accountability system, under our state law, which gave us, a lot more leverage there. Like, we needed to go in to be able to understand what was going on in those schools in this on this continuum. And then I'll have to say, over time, it didn't happen right away, but it definitely within a year or two, the quality of the reports that the schools were receiving and the districts were receiving really, and the amount of data that they get, whether it's through the class tool data of the classroom observations or through the instructional survey reports that they get, or just the findings and ratings on the turnaround practices rubric, they find it incredibly valuable, and we now actually have a spin-off of our MSV process that we call targeted site visits, which are a bit modified and a little less intensive, but they're voluntary to a larger set of schools and districts, and you'd be surprised that many take us up on that voluntary option. We have over 100 site visits a year in Massachusetts, whether they're the formal 2-day monitoring site visits or a modified targeted site visit. So the quality of the product that they're getting and the support that they get from our assistance teams to really unpack that data and make it meaningful and purposeful, I think helps sell the process. So I hope that's a helpful answer.
I mean, I'd also like to add to that, Erica, from my observations. Mm-hmm. You've also shepherded that process, and as soon as questions or issues or struggles arise, kind of working very closely with the district and or school to mitigate those and try to show where the value is and how this information would be used as a formative piece of information. So I think that's another piece that you've been, directly responsible for, so you might not be giving yourself enough credit. Anyway, the other question that they had was any insights on how you helped implementation to run smoothly, which I think I was hitting upon a bit, but I don't know if you have any additional tips.
Yeah, no, it takes a lot of support from department staff, and so, all of the direct assistance staff from the department and myself as the contract manager for this site visit work need to be all on the same page and very consistent in our messaging. And as Susan just said, like, we are constantly reminding districts and schools that this is formative, and we try to be as responsive as possible to their questions, concerns, or even responsive to their initial review of the report where they see things might be inaccurate or not factual, and we go back and we're as responsive as we can to those concerns. So it is quite an effort on the state's part to really back up the site visit process, and it helps when you have a strong partner that's going in and doing the data collection and reporting.
There's another question here that I see. It sounds like these schools were previously identified as priority schools. Were gains significant enough not to be re-identified under ESSA as CSI or TSI? And it's a complicated question, potentially.
It is a complicated question, but because I happen to know most of the schools in the sample, so if we're talking about the impact study, the 2016 study, did that help? How many of those schools really? I would say in Massachusetts we have it's around a 64% what we call turnaround rate. So schools that are identified in our state system and receive intensive supports from our statewide system of support, about 64% of those that were eligible to exit that status which it matches up to federal priority status in most cases. 64% of those were able to exit in 3 or more years of their turnaround journey.
Great. And then there's another question here about how the decision to use the class tool was made, just because it's so prevalently used in the early childhood grades, and wondering whether it was difficult to decide on this tool or not. Do you want to take that, or?
So I'll do a quick answer, and I think you can probably elaborate on it from your end. So you know, the site visit process is something that needs to go through our state procurement process out to bid, and in 2013 we had a large-scale RFQ that went out and had multiple bidders, and the class tool that was presented as part of the bid and the site visit proposed process by AIR really was a selling feature for us, so to speak. Just being able to know that this was a evidence-based research tool that could provide us consistent and reliable data, and that it was, you know, grounded in, you know, sort of behavioral markers and like what are students and teachers doing in classrooms. That is actually really helpful information for us. It was a very different frame and a very different classroom observation tool than any of our schools were used to, and so it did take some time to get folks used to it, but we have several districts now that actually use that tool on their own and have folks trained. We run a statewide training every year to give additional PD and support for our districts and schools that are receiving that class tool report, so that they understand what the data is telling them and they can understand how they could address the findings.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that, it's definitely prevalent in the early education grades, the class tool is, and but the study that the larger MET study that we're talking about really looked at elementary and secondary education. So it's one of the few instructional observation tools out there that has a certification process that actually has been tested, and so that ultimately is why it was selected. I will also say that they're quite busy addressing and training observers for early education. So that actually has been one of the challenges, I think, Erica, you've mentioned with regard to getting the developer to provide trainings in the state or in the higher level grades. It's an interesting observation. Thanks for that question. One other question that I see here relates to some things, Erica, I know you've talked a bit about with me. They were asking about whether specific offices, so examples, exceptional children, federal programs, still conduct their own compliance reviews. And I know this is something that you've been talking about within the agency. I don't know if you have anything you might share with regard to that.
Yes, so we absolutely still have several site visit review processes across the agency that, but most of those are at the district level, except for our charter school office, which tend to be obviously at the school level for schools. We're one of a few offices across the agency that do school-based site visits. And I will say that I am often called upon when anyone is thinking of engaging with a vendor to do school site visit processes, to sort of really get under the hood of our process to see what they can leverage as best practice in their processes as well. And I saw that there was a question asking specifically for our bid specifications, and I believe my contact information is part of this, and you could certainly reach out to me for that. And that's something that I've shared with other states, and I've also shared it within our own department, because it really has helped us get high quality partners on board to be able to conduct these really important formative visits for our schools, but collecting this invaluable data set for us at the state to drive our work.
And there's another question here, Erica, about giving a description of how you worked through an area of weakness that was identified on the turnaround practices and indicator rubric, and then part of the other states, the supportive part of the state system of support starts to provide direct support to the district and or school. Do you have maybe an example on how that happens?
Yeah, I'll give one. I'll try to make it quick. So one example is that I could go on for days. One example is that we had identified through site visits and also through our state assessment results and accountability results, like we're having this, persistent challenge at the middle school and high school levels, right? And so specifically for our high schools, the ones that were in quote unquote turnaround, it felt like they had all the right ingredients. It just implementation didn't seem to be going as well. So we actually, we've done several things, but one was we actually went out and conducted a study using the MSV protocol, went out and had our research partner and Susan's team go out and interview 3 schools that were not in turnaround, 3 high schools, and run an MSV process on them. And then be able to say, how are those schools that are high performing similarly situated to our schools in turnaround in terms of demographics and urban and suburban, wherever they are in geographically, but then what were the practices, what were their sort of strong practices at those schools as compared to some of ours, and produced a report, and that's one of the ones that I highlighted in my part of the presentation. That's on our website. So giving that, additional look at effective practices sort of even outside of our turnaround schools, that was a really big help. And then I think too, we have our video series, which is another thing that we do. So in addition to getting direct supports in these site visits, and we also try to help our schools be able to see and hear others. They don't always get to go out and visit each other, so we've done a series of videos. My colleague Michael Seymour is on, and a former colleague, Amanda Trainer, has done some of this work for us, is on as well. And those videos have been an invaluable resource. We go in to schools and that are performing well or doing a specific component of the turnaround practices well, and we say, hey, tell us your story. And then we do a video of that school, the students, the staff, the administrators, and they're on our website, and they're able to be used by other schools and districts across the state. And we also have viewing guides that accompany them so that schools and districts can watch them and then ask themselves some thought-provoking questions about that are relevant to their practice.
Thanks. So there's another question here that we can just answer really quickly about whether there was an analysis on how school budget was allocated vis-a-vis performance indicators. And I believe by performance indicators, you can tell me if I'm wrong, you probably meant the turnaround practices and indicators rubric. And the answer is no. And it may be a little bit difficult to figure out how that might be done. But Erica, I don't know if you have any means for doing that based on the application process.
Yeah, so this is a great question. We right now are in the process of trying to figure out as a state how to match dollars to impact on student outcomes for many different purposes, right? We have a new state funding allocation law in effect in Massachusetts. Our legislature is asking for that type of information. The federal government is asking the information with all of our stimulus resources. And so we're working on that. What I can say is that we have done, and I wouldn't say there were statistical analyses, but there have been points in time that we'll take a sample of our schools. So for example, when we looked at the SIG schools, we did analyze what were sort of the patterns of funding that seem to correlate more to success than others. And so, we have done some of that analysis, but some of it is quite old and definitely something that we want to make sure we prioritize in the near future. That is incredibly complicated and tricky, especially at the school level when state financial data is all at the district level, so it gets tricky for sure.
Here's another question about evidence-based practices, Erica, about what's the role of the state system of support in supporting implementation of evidence-based practices to improve student outcomes, including the selection of evidence-based practices and monitoring how well practitioners are implementing the practices, consistency, fidelity, and scaling over time. Ooh, big one.
I know, that is a big one. This is an eternal work in progress. The evidence-based practice criteria under federal ESSA guidelines, especially for school improvement, it's a high bar, right? And it's quite a bit of work and effort, but our planning process, so we call them sustainable improvement plans in Massachusetts, but our plans have a requirement that they need to meet evidence-based requirements, and then we have a team that, a partnership with our Office of Planning and Research that provides assistance and support to both our districts and schools in finding and selecting strategies that are evidence-based, and then also building the capacity of our assistance teams, those direct support staff, to be able to support schools in doing that as well. And then, actually our site visit process actually does give us some really good information. It might not be sort of at the quantitative level, but at the qualitative level for us to dig in and see what the effectiveness of some of those systems.
Okay, there's a lot of big questions in here, so prepare yourself. So there's a variety, so one question that came in, there's a variety of plausible approaches for directing ESSA school improvement funds in ways that could lead to schools focusing on improving on these dimensions. The state working directly with schools, for example, or giving money directly to schools along with information that Massachusetts has generated and trusting their judgment, incentivizing them to partner with organizations that have evidence that demonstrates they've successfully worked with schools to improve on these dimensions. How is Massachusetts thinking about the right role for the state in supporting school improvement?
Great question. I think the short answer for this is, one size doesn't fit all, and trying to have a state support system that can be flexible enough to be able to do direct support, right? But we don't have the capacity necessarily to do that for everyone. So being able to be nimble enough to provide direct support to the most needy and know who those schools and districts are, and then maybe letting others sort of access resources and supports at a sort of lighter touch. Those are all incredibly complex issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, but trying as a state to be as supportive as possible. So I think our commissioner, charges us with acting first and foremost as state as partner, and so that is an approach that we take to our work and try to communicate to districts and schools. It's not always heard, but we try to show it in our actions that, we're here to add value to their work, and that we're here to build off of the greatness that already exists within them at the school and district level. And so really trying to ground our improvement efforts in that spirit is where we have been, but I think we're taking an even more intentional approach to being seen as state as partner in the future. And again, trying to maybe shift our focus away from sort of compliance and compliance and following rules and regulations, and more trying to think about how do we focus on supporting schools and districts in the really hard work of addressing racial inequities, right? And delivering culturally responsive teaching and learning to students every single day. That's really where we're trying to focus now and be state as partners. So I don't know if that quite answers the question, but I hope it gives a little bit of an answer.
Yeah, and feel free to add additional probes if you don't feel like we've quite responded to your questions. One other biggie, what is the vision for building capacity across districts to assess their own instruction through observation? And this is assuming the state doesn't have the capacity to support all districts and schools this way, meaning providing routine feedback. Yeah.
I love that question. So this is, we have been fortunate in Massachusetts, I have to say, to be able to, we can provide we found ways to provide this sort of site visit process, right, to all of the schools that are most of the schools that are in our purview, right? And we know that in other states, the metrics that are used to decide CSI and TSI schools and your state systems are all, can make it almost impossible to be able to do that. In Massachusetts, we've been fortunate that we can provide this support, but it is something that we're thinking a lot about, especially considering, we have several districts that have been part of this work with us since 2014. They know the turnaround practices continuum inside and out. And, we have in the past tried to promote self-assessment, and I think we're going to start maybe focusing a little bit more of our attention on that. There may be some schools and districts that can do some of this work on their own with some additional support and help from us. But I think there'll still be, a need for us to have a heavier hand in some. But it is definitely something that we try to instill in the schools, is that, this isn't the only source of information about the state of your school, right? This is our site visit process and any other interactions from the department are really just a splash in the pan, right, of a typical year of a student or a school. And we really do try to help build their capacity to use this data in a way that links up their own information and informs their own embedded continuous cycle of improvement. So building that capacity to engage in a continuous cycle of improvement is the core of our assistance work. So this is just one piece, but we're always looking to build the school and district's capacity so that when we do step away, they'll be able to sustain the work on their own.
Thanks. This question, there's another question here that I think you may have partially addressed already in the implications discussion, Erica. It's a question about hearing how you're building, the system is building in or approaches equity, diversity, and inclusivity in a way that supports all students. And I know that this is, you're in a continuous improvement mode all of the time with this monitoring process. I think that over time you've made a few adjustments based on that. Mm-hmm. I know you're planning on a much bigger overhaul. Maybe an example of how that has happened over time?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so, I think we're in that space of what gets measured gets done, right? And our turnaround practices rubric was built based off of a previous set of the site visit indicators in an earlier iteration of our accountability system and our monitoring system. And it didn't specifically look for culture responsive practices in classrooms. The language wasn't even there. And, you can certainly go through and pick out places where you could make connections to specific practices that we hoped that we were seeing in schools and districts, but it wasn't specifically called out. And so to Susan's point, there have been several times over the last few years since 2014 where we have made adjustments to the continuum by trying to infuse more look-fors relative to culture responsive practices in schools. So for example, we were recognizing that there were some gaps in our ability to learn more about student agency through the site visit reports at the secondary level specifically, because that's a key driver for racial equity specifically in the secondary space. And so we actually worked with some partners, the Everyone Graduates Center at Johns Hopkins University and Bob Balfans and with the AIR, and went back to our rubric and said, let's build a secondary rubric. And that looks more at student agency, looked at college and career readiness. We were, trying to call out more look-fors in that space, and we've developed an entirely new rubric, but also did that in a way that we were still maintaining the integrity of our longitudinal data set, right? So like we didn't want to change it completely, so we couldn't look back to previous years of high school site visit data and not be able to make those comparisons over time. So we had to be really careful about where and how we made changes, and some of it was just adding new indicators or making adjustments to wording within specific indicators that would still let those let us be able to compare them over time. But we were able to get much better information to schools and districts around diversity, equity, inclusion, culturally responsive practices through those tweaks. And so now I think we're at a place in time where, we'll see where Massachusetts will feel we can add the most value in supporting schools and districts in some sort of data collection on culturally responsive practices at either the classroom, school, and or district level. And so time will tell what that looks like, but I think it will be a bigger overhaul potentially to our site visit rubric than maybe it was in the past when we were making those slight tweaks.
Good. I will say also, I know that in terms of the classroom observation tool, the developer actually has identified a few markers of culturally responsive instruction within there too. I mean, it was already built in, but sort of building out and kind of identifying those so that people people receiving the feedback who want to look a little more deeply at certain markers can. So that's another thing that I know has happened. I think we are just about done, most of the questions. If you do have a question, please put them in the chat. I just want to make sure I'm not missing any as I scroll through here. Any final words that you want to say, Erica, before we close up, if we don't get any more questions?
No, I mean, I feel like maybe one final thing that I could say is just I've been thinking about my response to an earlier question around giving an example of like changes or supports that we made relative to like the data that we're getting out of the site visits. And in addition to the, sort of the secondary example that I gave, I think there's, another is, providing family engagement was one, right? And we had a couple of schools that really stuck out as exemplars, and we decided to go deeper, right, and dig deeper in those schools in a few different ways. And one of them was actually doing a video. Another example of how we use the data to drive additional supports, and I think this is the question actually from way at the beginning, was relative to our English learners and our students with disabilities. We had a lot of our schools scored low on those two indicators on our turnaround practices continuum, and so we worked with our research partners to develop some additional guidance and resources around what schools that were seeing high scores in those areas on the site visit process and in academic performance, like what were the practices that they were engaging in, and be able to reproduce that as a sort of a shorter resource for schools to be able to access relative to those particular student groups.
Yeah, I think that's a great example because you're collecting your monitoring data using kind of valid and reliable measures over time. You can do an analysis and see where the weak spots are or challenges are for the schools, and you found a couple outliers to share the strategies. So that seems like a really good use of the data. All right, before we're letting you go, a few other questions. As a local control state, what aspect of your state school law do you think provides DESE with the most leverage with districts? I think you might have an answer for this one.
Our statute is pretty clear that that the state has a role to play in opening up the opportunities for autonomies and flexibilities at the school level, separate and apart from a district, and that it's very clear that we have a role in understanding what's happening in those schools on a very regular basis, and it also gives us the leverage to be able to place schools into receivership if after 3 or more years they're not seeing the improvement gains that were set for them. So we have quite a bit of legal leverage in that space. That's a good answer.
And one final question from Jess, Karen, just about providing feedback to the schools in terms of the weaknesses they have and working with them. And I think you may have mentioned this, but maybe it wasn't super clear. The reports that the schools get on the ratings, provide information on where they stand in the rubric, as well as some contextual information specific to the schools, like a brief kind of write-up of what the observations were and where the weaknesses were. Do you have other examples that you might want to share? Or
yeah, we have. They absolutely get this very comprehensive data set, and again, like Susan said, some of it is just ratings on the rubric, but then also evidence to support those ratings in qualitative form, right? So they're quite lengthy. They get a lot of information, and then they also we give them a report that shows them their ratings over time. So if it's a school that's been with us for 3 or 4 years, they can go back and look and see the progress they've made over time. We also have additional resources that we provide along with the report, saying what questions can you ask yourself about your scores or your findings in the report. Where are your glows, where are your grows, how do you leverage the areas where you're seeing improvement, how do you look back and see where things might be off track, and then we have our assistance teams who really do help. They really do help them unpack that data, mash it up with their own at the school and district level, and then really engage in that reflection process.
Great. Thank you. It looks like those are all the questions, and unlike many things these days, we're hoping to give you all a little bit of time back. But before you leave, we really, if you enjoyed this webinar or if you want to provide us some constructive feedback, we would love to hear it. The Department of Education and REL Northeast Islands really wants your feedback, so you can click on the link that's in the chat, or we will put you in direct link with the survey. Thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate it, and we're really excited to share this research and the exciting work that Massachusetts is doing. Thank you to Jing Tong and to Erica for co-presenting today, and have a great day.